She had $342 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a locked cedar box that she would not let out of her hands, in a dead man's name she was still learning to stop flinching at. She was not running from grief. She had never been allowed enough of the marriage to grieve it properly. She was running from what she knew. Elara Voss, Elara Bauer, daughter of a German clockmaker from Cincinnati, widow of St. Louis's most respected physician, stepped off the southbound train at Dusthaven, New Mexico territory on a Tuesday in October of 1879 and looked out at a country that did not care one whit or said about her past. The red earth stretched away in every direction. The sky was enormous and indifferent. The wind came off the mesa like a clean knife. She exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Behind her, somewhere in the green and polished world, she'd fled a man with a judge's robe, and her dead husband's surname was looking for her. He had the law and the money and the patience of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. She had the box. She had $342. And she had a letter from a man named Maddox, 6 pages long, badly spelled in places, honest in all of them, that had somehow convinced her a marriage of practical necessity in the desert might be safer than the life she was escaping. What the letter had not told her was that Maddox already had a woman living in his house. If Elara's story moves you, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit that like button and stay with her until the very end, because this road is a long one and she deserves every witness she can get. The station at Dusthaven was not much of a station. A clapboard building with a hand-painted sign, a hitching post, 3 mules, and a boy of about 12 asleep against the water barrel. Elara stepped down from the train car with her 2 bags in one hand and the cedar box pressed against her ribs with the other arm, and she stood in the October heat and understood perhaps for the first time that she had done something irrevocable. The train did not wait long. It hissed and groaned and pulled itself away, taking with it the last direct connection to everything she had ever known. And she watched it go with the deliberate calm of someone who has already finished the business of being afraid and is now simply getting on with things. She turned to face the town. Dusthaven was built on a flat shelf of red earth between 2 ridges of broken volcanic rock, and it had the look of a place that had decided to exist through sheer stubbornness rather than any particular strategic advantage. There was a main street, one street unpaved, rutted with wagon wheels, lined with businesses in various states of optimism. A general store, a feed and tack, a church whose white paint was peeling in the heat, a saloon with no name above the door, which Elara privately thought said more about the saloon than a name ever could. At the far end of the street, where the land began to slope upward toward the northern ridge, she could see the dark shapes of ranch buildings against the sky. She had a name. She had a rough description of the road. She had no idea what she was walking into. The boy against the water barrel had woken up and was watching her with the frank curiosity of children and dogs. "You know a man named Maddox?" she asked him. He blinked. "Everybody knows Mr. Maddox." "Can you tell me how to reach his property?" "His property's about 3 miles north." He sat up straighter as if remembering manners. "You could get a ride from Prentice at the livery, or you could wait. Somebody from the Maddox spread usually comes in for supplies Tuesday afternoons." He squinted at her. "You the bride he sent for?" She had not considered how much a small town would already know. She felt the heat rise in her face and kept it from showing in her expression through years of practice at concealing things. "I'm Elara Voss," she said, as though that answered it. It seemed to satisfy him well enough. He pointed her toward the livery. She walked with her back straight and her cedar box pressed close, and she did not allow herself to look around too much because she knew the look of a woman who was afraid of being watched, and she would not be that woman in public. She had been that woman in the last year of her marriage, moving through the rooms of a beautiful house in St. Louis with her eyes down and her movements quiet, learning to make herself invisible. She had survived it. She was done with it. The liveryman Prentice was a broad-shouldered man of about 60, with a sun-weathered face and the careful manner of someone who observed a great deal and said very little. He quoted her a fair price for the wagon ride north, did not ask her name or business, and had her underway within 20 minutes. She sat up beside him on the bench and watched the town fall behind them. The land changed as they moved north. The flat shelf gave way to rougher terrain, scrub cedar and juniper. On the slopes, red rock outcroppings and the occasional pale line of a dry creek bed threading between rises. The sky was enormous. Elara had grown up in Cincinnati and lived in St. Louis, and she had thought she knew what sky looked like, But she understood now that she had only ever seen sky through gaps between buildings above roof lines framed by windows. This sky was something else entirely. It went on and on in every direction, pale blue shading to a deeper color at the zenith. And below it the earth was red and rust and ochre, and the whole thing had a quality of great and ancient patience that made her own urgencies feel for a moment very small. She did not find this comforting. She found it clarifying. They came over a low rise and she saw the Maddox spread below them, a main house of adobe and rough timber, a barn, two outbuildings, a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon breeze, a corral with half a dozen horses. It was not large by the standards of the great Texas ranches she had heard of, but it was solid. Someone had worked hard to build it and harder to keep it. The evidence of care was in the repaired fencing, the maintained roof, the orderly arrangement of the outbuildings. Prentice drew the wagon up at the gate. She thanked him, paid him, and climbed down with her bags. She was halfway to the front door when it opened. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not Cole Maddox. She was perhaps 35, fair-haired, with a pleasant face and the particular kind of beauty that comes from health and confidence rather than delicacy. She wore an apron over a good dress and carried a dish towel, and she looked at Elara with an expression that was carefully composed but not quite welcoming. "Mrs. Voss," she said. "Yes." Elara kept walking because stopping would be a kind of defeat. "I'm looking for Mr. Maddox. He's out with the cattle." The woman's voice was even and unhurried. "I'm Clara Whitfield. I help out here." A pause that was exactly one beat too long. "Please come in. You must be tired from the journey." Elara came in. The inside of the house was clean and organized in the way that someone other than the owner had organized it, the particular neatness of a woman who has imposed her own order on a man's household. Curtains at the windows, dried flowers on the table. A good smell from the kitchen, something with onions and herbs. The kind of smell that said this was not a temporary arrangement. She noticed all of this in the 10 seconds it took her to cross the front room. "How long have you been helping out?" Elara asked, setting her bags down and keeping the cedar box in her arm. Clara's eyes went briefly to the box and then back to Elara's face. "About 8 months now, since my husband passed." She gestured toward the kitchen. "I can put on coffee. Mr. Maddox should be back within the hour." "That would be lovely," Elara said. She sat at the kitchen table with her cedar box in her lap, and she drank the coffee that Clara Whitfield poured for her, and she said the right things at the right intervals, and she watched Clara the way she had learned to watch people who had something to lose in her presence. The older woman was not hostile, not exactly. She was managing something. She was performing the role of helpful neighbor with the concentration of someone who was aware it was a performance. 8 months, Elara thought, in a town this small, in a house this intimate. The women at the church social in Dusthaven would not call Clara Whitfield Mr. Maddox's neighbor. She would bet her $342 on that. She was still sitting there turning this over in her mind when the front door opened. Cole Maddox was not what she had expected. She had not expected beauty. The letter had been plain-spoken in a way that did not suggest a man preoccupied with impressions. But she had assembled some rough image from the facts, 38-years-old rancher. Widower, one daughter veteran of the war. She had expected weathered, incompetent, and possibly cold. He was all of those things. He was also, she realized with a kind of internal thud, someone whose face showed the particular damage of long loneliness. The set of the jaw, the slight tension around the eyes of a man who had learned not to expect much from people. He was tall and lean in the way of men who work rather than exercise, with dark hair, beginning to go silver at the temples, and hands that were calloused and capable and very still at his sides. He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at her, and the first emotion she could read on his face was not welcome or warmth. It was something much closer to guilt. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Maddox." She stood up because she was not going to have this conversation sitting down. "Thank you for having me." Something shifted briefly in his expression, something she couldn't quite name. He took off his hat and held it and looked at her with an attention that was very different from the idle appraisal she'd braced herself for. He was actually looking at her, taking her measure. "How was the journey?" he said. "Long," she said, "but I'm here now." Clara set a third cup on the table and excused herself with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had spent months learning when to disappear. Cole Maddox sat down across from Elara and put his hat on the table between them. Neither of them reached for the coffee. "I owe you an honest conversation," he said. "Not a question, not an apology, Simply a statement of obligation. I think you probably do, she agreed. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man assembling words carefully. She waited. She had learned patience in a marriage that punished impatience. Clara Whitfield has been a good deal of help to me since her husband died, he said. She's become accustomed to things here, to the way things are run. And to you, Elara said. He met her eyes and did not look away. Yes, and the town has formed impressions, she said. Yes, she nodded slowly. She picked up her coffee and drank some of it, mostly to have something to do with her hands. It was good coffee. Clara Whitfield made excellent coffee. What do you want to do? She asked him. The question seemed to surprise him. People who asked Cole Maddox what he wanted were apparently not common. I wanted a mother for my daughter, he said after a moment. Someone steady, someone who'd be here. He paused. What was in that advertisement was the truth. What I need here is the truth. I won't pretend I've managed things in a way that makes this simple. Nothing worthwhile is simple, she said. No. He looked at the cedar box in her lap and looked away. That's a heavy thing to carry. It is, she said, and did not elaborate. They sat in the October light in the kitchen that smelled of Clara Whitfield's dinner and took each other's measure. Elara thought about the 8 months of small adjustments Clara had made to this household. She thought about the way Cole Maddox had looked at her when he walked in, that complex, guilty look, and understood that whatever she did next would set the terms of everything that followed. She was very good at understanding terms. I'd like to meet your daughter, she said. Something eased in his expression, just slightly. She's at the schoolhouse until 4, he said. I can take you over. Good, Elara said and picked up her bags. I'll need a room. Not the largest one, I imagine that's yours. Whichever is comfortable. There's a room at the end of the hall, he said, and something in his voice suggested that this particular room had been the subject of some domestic negotiation he hadn't quite resolved. It's small, I can have it. Small is fine, she said. I don't take up much space. This was not entirely true, but she said it with enough conviction that he seemed to believe it. She followed him down the hall. The room at the end was small and spare and faced east, which meant morning light. There was a narrow bed with a blue and white quilt and a window that looked out over the corral. Someone she suspected Clara had put fresh flowers in a jar on the sill, and she didn't know whether this was a welcome or a territorial marker, and she supposed it didn't much matter. She put the cedar box on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the horses moving in the corral, and she pressed one hand to her side where $342 were sewn into her petticoat, and she breathed. She was not safe. She had bought herself time, but she was not safe. Outside in the kitchen, she could hear Clara Whitfield moving around with the quiet competence of a woman who believed this was her house or would be. Elara understood that kind of belief. She had once believed she was safe in a beautiful house in St. Louis because a man with kind eyes had given her flowers every Sunday and then told her very quietly what she was not allowed to say in his presence. She was not going to make the same mistake again. She also was not going to be crowded out of a room she'd been invited into. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and opened her door. In the kitchen, Cole Maddox was speaking quietly to Clara Whitfield near the stove. They stood close together in the unconscious way of people who have grown used to each other's proximity. When Elara appeared in the doorway, they both looked up. Clara's expression went carefully neutral. Cole's went something she couldn't read. I thought I'd help with dinner, Elara said pleasantly. If there's anything to do. There was a pause that lasted about 2 seconds longer than it needed to. I've got things in hand, Clara said. I'm sure you do, Elara said, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the kitchen table. I'll keep you company then. I've been traveling all day and the kitchen smells wonderful. She sat there and she did not go anywhere. After a moment, Clara turned back to the stove. Elara picked up a bowl of green beans that were sitting on the table, found a knife, and began to snap them with the precise, quiet efficiency of a woman who has done 10,000 small tasks without being thanked for any of them. She did not look at Cole Maddox. She did not need to. She could feel the calibration happening in the room. 3 people rearranging themselves around a new reality, testing the new weights and distances. She had survived worse recalibrations. The daughter arrived at 4:15, brought home by a neighbor's wagon. Her name was Nora, and she was 8 years old, and from the moment she appeared in the doorway with her school things and her dark eyes full of evaluation, Elara understood that this was the person whose opinion actually mattered in the Maddox household. Nora looked at her the way a very intelligent child looks at something unexpected. Not with hostility exactly, but with the kind of thorough assessment that is more honest than any adult appraisal. She was dark-haired like her father, with a serious face and a stubborn set to her jaw that was pure inheritance. "You're the lady from the letter," Nora said. "I am," Elara said. "Elara Voss. It's very good to meet you." "My papa says you're from St. Louis." "I am. He says you speak German." "I do. My father was German." Nora considered this. Then, "Can you ride a horse?" "Yes." "Mrs. Whitfield can't," Nora said with the calm neutrality of a child reporting a fact. "She's afraid of them." From across the room, Elara could feel Clara Whitfield elect not to respond to this. "Horses are reasonable creatures," Elara said. "If you understand them." Nora looked at her for another long moment in the way of someone filing information. Then she went to wash her hands for dinner. Cole Maddox was standing by the far window, and when Elara glanced at him, he was watching his daughter, and his expression for just that one unguarded moment was everything she had ever thought a person could want from the inside of a house. Love so thorough and uncomplicated, it didn't know how to be anything other than what it was. She looked away quickly because it was too much to witness without feeling something. Dinner was an exercise in triangulation. Clara served beautifully and spoke well, and was clearly beloved by Nora in the particular way that children love adults who are competent and consistent. Cole said little, which seemed to be his habitual mode. Elara listened and watched and said the right things at the right times, which was a skill she had refined over 3 years of medical dinners with powerful men who considered her decorative. After dinner, Cole offered to show Elara the property before dark. Clara stayed to clean up. Nora declared that she was coming too, in a voice that made it clear this was not a negotiation. They walked out into the October evening. The three of them, and the sky above the mesa had gone to orange and deep red, and the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and the desert held the heat of the day like a stored thing. "The north pasture is the best land," Cole said, pointing. "Spring water comes down from the ridge, which is why I put the main buildings here. The problem right now is the Hartfield Cattle Company has been claiming the rights to the water source. There's a surveyor's dispute." He paused. "It's the thing that keeps me up at night." "Is there documentation?" she asked. He glanced at her. "Some. Deed survey markers." "Some," he said again, and this time there was something in his voice that was less than confident. "I can read survey maps," she said. "My father had property disputes for years in Cincinnati. I learned the paperwork." He looked at her with a new kind of attention. Not the same as before. This was something more thoughtful. "That's a useful thing," he said. "I have various useful things," she said mildly, and looked out at the mesa and said nothing more about it. Nora had run ahead to check on a horse she favored. They stood in the fading light for a moment in a silence that was not comfortable but was at least honest. "I'm sorry," Cole said then quietly, "for the situation you are walking into. Clara, it's not what you might think it is, or not entirely, but it's also not nothing. I didn't manage it well. I didn't know how." She turned to look at him. The last light was going and his face was in partial shadow, and he looked like something carved from the same red rock as the country. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "I am going to tell you something true. I did not come here the way most women come to mail order arrangements. My reasons were more complicated than loneliness and a desire for a home." She paused, choosing her words with care. "I will tell you more when I know you better. But I want you to know right now, tonight, that I have no intention of making your life harder. I have every intention of making it more workable. I am a practical woman, and I am not naive, and I do not frighten easily." He was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. "Good," she said. "Now let's go get your daughter before she decides to ride in the dark." They walked back toward the lights of the house, and behind them the mesa went dark, and the stars came out enormous and indifferent, the same stars she had seen through the train window only that morning, and she carried her cedar box in her arm and her secrets in her chest, and she thought, "I am alive. I am here. Whatever is coming, I am not waiting for it in St. Louis." That night she lay in the small east-facing room and listened to the sounds of the desert outside her window. Insects whined, the occasional movement of horses in the corral, and she thought about Clara Whitfield sleeping somewhere in this same house, and Cole Maddox lying awake somewhere in it too, most likely, and Nora in her small room that probably had a rag doll on the windowsill. She thought about the cedar box on the floor beside her bed. She thought about a man in St. Louis with her dead husband's name and a judge's authority and the patience of someone who had never once been told no by the law. She reached down and touched the box in the dark just to confirm it was there. Then she closed her eyes. She had $342 in a locked box and a room that faced east. That was enough to start with. In the days that followed her arrival, Elara committed herself to learning the geography of the household the way she had learned everything that mattered to her by paying attention before she acted. The Maddox house was not a large house. It had been built for function, not impression, thick adobe walls that held the desert's temperature differential, small windows that kept the summer heat out, and the winter warmth in a kitchen that was the genuine center of the household's life rather than a room for show. She had lived in a house in St. Louis that had 4 sitting rooms and a formal dining room that was never used, and a kitchen she had been gently discouraged from entering. This was different in every particular, and she found the difference suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Cole had built it himself. She learned the central structure and the additions, both with help from a Mexican laborer named Santos, who still came twice a year to check the roof and the walls and drink coffee at the kitchen table. He had built it after the war in the years when men who had survived that particular catastrophe were either destroyed by it or driven outward into some new territory, geographic or personal. Cole had gone west and built things. She was beginning to understand that this was not incidental to his character, but central to it. He was a man who responded to destruction by making. She found this privately easier to be near than the alternatives. The water situation was worse than she'd initially understood. On her 4th day, while Cole was occupied with the north fence, she spread the territorial survey maps on the kitchen table alongside the claim documents the Hartfield Cattle Company had filed, and she worked through them with the methodical patience of a woman who had grown up watching her father pursue property disputes through German administrative systems that made American territorial law look almost simple. What she found was not immediately clear, but it was there: a date discrepancy in the easement, filing an apparent duplication of a survey marker that had been reported to the territorial office twice under slightly different coordinates, and a note in the margin of the Hartfield claim in a handwriting that was different from the rest of the document, suggesting that the document had been altered after its original preparation. This was not proof of fraud, not yet, but it was a thread. She made her notes carefully, and then she folded the maps back along their original creases and put them where she had found them, because she was not yet sure what she was going to do with the thread, and because doing things carefully was how she had always managed to do anything at all. The evenings were the strangest part of those early days. After dinner, Nora went to her room with her schoolwork, and Clara departed, and the house contracted to its nighttime configuration. Cole at the far end of the table with the ranch accounts, or a journal of some kind. He closed when she came near, and Elara with the survey notes or her own correspondence, or simply nothing, sitting with a cup of tea and the sound of the desert outside and the lamp between them. They did not try to fill the silence with conversation. They sat in it, and the silence was awkward, and then it was less awkward, and somewhere in the middle of the first week, it became simply the particular texture of the evenings in this house, comfortable in the way of things you have not tried to force. She noticed how he looked at the door when the wind picked up. She noticed that he always checked the water barrel before he came inside at night. She noticed that he made a small, specific sound, a low exhale, barely audible, when he was working through something difficult in his head. She did not remark on any of these things. She filed them. And she noticed in turn that he was doing the same with her, that he tracked when she moved through the house and adjusted his own movements accordingly, giving her room without making a ceremony of it, that he left the lamp burning in the kitchen past the hour when he would normally have extinguished it on the evenings when she was still up, that on the 3rd day when she came in from the corral with her skirt filthy from where a horse had bumped her against the fence rail, he said nothing at all about it. Not the skirt, not the horses, not whether she should be out there, and simply handed her a clean rag with the straightforward courtesy of a man who considers your business. Your business. That was when she started to think she might actually be able to do this. Dusthaven itself she studied from the distances of their supply runs and the conversations she absorbed while Cole talked to neighbors at the feed store and the general store and the handful of other places men exchanged news. She was building a map of the social terrain, the same way she was building one of the physical terrain, identifying the weights and pressures, who owed whom, what, who had standing, and who was merely loud, where the actual decisions were made versus where the discussions were held. She was doing this not from instinct, but from a skill she developed in St. Louis, where the beautiful dining rooms full of powerful men had required her to understand every dynamic in the room in order to move through it safely. She thought sometimes about how useful that skill was, and how strange that it had required 3 years of an unhappy marriage to teach it to her. Edmund had not been a bad man in the strictest sense. He had not raised his hand to her. He had provided in the material sense generously. He had been interested in her intelligence in the way that men of his station were occasionally interested in intelligent wives as an accessory, a source of quiet private pride, something that distinguished him from men who married simply for beauty. He had wanted a companion who could follow his thinking, and she had been that, and he had told her regularly that she was exceptional. What he had not wanted was a companion who had thoughts of her own that complicated his. She had understood this about the 4th year of her marriage, and she had done what a woman in that position learned to do. She had found the narrow channel of thought and opinion that was permitted to her, and she had moved within it with the precise economy of someone navigating a space that is barely large enough to turn around in. She had told herself this was fine. She had told herself that all marriages required accommodation and that this was simply the particular shape of hers. And then Edmund had given her the box and told her there wasn't much time, and she had understood that the accommodation had always been built on something she hadn't known about, and the life she had arranged herself to fit inside had not been after all what she'd been told it was. She did not think about this often. She had learned that there was a particular kind of thinking that consumed more than it returned, and grievance was near the top of that list. She had taken the box, and she had sold what she could quickly, and she had sewn the money into her petticoat, and she had read the advertisements, and she had written to Cole Maddox in Dusthaven, New Mexico territory, because his advertisement had been the most honest one she'd found, specific about what it needed, honest about what it couldn't offer, and notable for what it didn't say. It didn't say anything about beauty or devotion or the romantic nature of frontier life. It said a man with 40 acres and a daughter and a need for someone steady. She had thought she could be steady. She had been right. The question she had not asked herself, had refused to ask in the urgent practicality of those weeks in St. Louis, was whether steady was going to be enough for her. She was beginning to suspect it wasn't. Not because the situation was insufficient, but because the situation was more than she'd expected, and more was not a thing she had been allowing herself to want. On the 8th night, she lay in her east-facing room and listened to the sounds of the house settling in the cold, the particular creaks of adobe and timber, and she heard Cole's door close at the far end of the hall, and the sound of it, the ordinary domestic sound of a man going to bed in the same house, was so different from the sound of Edmund's door closing, which had always carried with it the specific quality of a verdict, that she felt something ease in her chest that she hadn't even known was tight. She reached down and touched the cedar box in the dark. Tomorrow, Gideon rode to Santa Fe. The message was ready. She had been careful with the wording. 3 weeks, she thought, maybe 4. She had survived worse waits. She closed her eyes and breathed the desert air, and outside the stars wheeled overhead in their patient indifference, and the windmill turned, and the horses moved in the corral, and she slept. The first week was an education. Elara learned the rhythms of the Maddox ranch the way she had learned most things in her life, by watching carefully and saying less than she knew. She was up before anyone else in the mornings, dressed by the time the sky outside her east window went pale, and in the kitchen before the stove had been lit. Cole came in from the earliest barn chores to find her with coffee already made, and the bread started, and on the 3rd morning he sat down and drank the coffee and looked at her with an expression she had begun to recognize, that quiet recalibration like a man adjusting to a change in the weather. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. "I want something to do. I'm not decorative." He looked down at his coffee. "My wife was," he said. Then, as though he hadn't meant to say it, Eleanor. The ranch wasn't what she expected, the isolation. "Most things aren't what we expect," Elara said carefully. He didn't answer that. Clara Whitfield arrived each morning around 8 and stayed through dinner. The arrangement had the settled quality of a habit months in the forming, and Elara moved through it with the patience of someone who understood that established patterns do not yield to pressure, only to the slow erosion of a new and better pattern taking their place. She was cheerful and competent, and managed the careful geometry of the household without direct confrontation, and she watched the ground she was standing on, the way she had learned to watch everything with the specific attention of someone who knows the ground can shift. What she was actually doing in those early mornings before anyone else was awake was the ranch accounts. Cole had shown her the ledgers on the 2nd day, not because he'd volunteered them, but because she had asked, and asking directly was a thing she had always done that had always unsettled people, and she had learned to rely on that effect. The ledgers were kept in a system that was technically coherent but practically difficult, the accumulation of a man who was very good at running cattle and very uncomfortable with paperwork. She spent 3 mornings reorganizing them without saying anything, and on the fourth morning, she left her revised summary on the kitchen table before Cole came in, and when he picked it up and read it, he went very still. "You found the Hartfield discrepancy," he said. "There's a fence easement being claimed on the North Water access that predates your deed by about 4 years," she said, pouring coffee. "But the date on the easement document doesn't match the territorial survey register from that year. Someone filed something they shouldn't have." He set the papers down. He looked at her with an attention that was different from any look he'd given her before. This one was something closer to respect, and she found that it meant more to her than she expected. "Where did you learn to read territorial documents?" he said. "My husband was involved in a land dispute in St. Louis," she said carefully. "I learned enough to understand what I was looking at." He nodded slowly, and she could see him deciding not to press further, and she was grateful for it. She was coming to understand a man who extended a kind of fundamental courtesy that did not require anything in return. He did not ask things he didn't have the right to ask. He did not push through closed doors. It was the quality she trusted most in him because it was the quality she had found most rare in men. Nora was a harder study. The girl had decided in the thorough way of children that Elara was an interesting problem. She wasn't hostile. She had been raised too well for open hostility, but she tested consistently and observed constantly, and Elara had the feeling of being evaluated by a small and very serious committee of one. She accepted this because it was honest, and honest was something she was learning to value more than comfortable. The horse was the turning point, or the first one. It happened on the 5th day. Elara was at the corral fence watching the horses doing nothing in particular except the useful business of being somewhere visible when she heard the sound from the paddock. A short, sharp noise that her body understood before her mind did the sound of something going wrong. She was over the fence before she'd consciously decided to move. Nora had been trying to saddle the roan not for the first time clearly, but something had spooked him, and he'd sidestepped into her, and she'd lost her footing and gone down in the dust, and the horse was moving in tight circles the way a frightened horse does hooves too close to a small body. Elara did not shout. She walked into the paddock with her hands at her sides, voice low and even. Nothing she said particularly mattering, only the tone of it, slow, unafraid, certain. She moved to the roan's head and put her hand on his neck, kept walking him in a slow circle until he settled. Then she looked at Nora, who was sitting up in the dust with mud on her dress jewel set and eyes very bright. "Are you hurt?" Elara asked. "No," Nora said. The word came out stubbornly. "Good." Elara looked at the horse. "He's frightened of the left side. You came at him from the wrong angle." Nora stood up and brushed herself off with great dignity. "I know how to saddle a horse." "I know you do," Elara said. "But horses have bad days too. You have to read them before you commit." A silence. "Are you going to tell my father?" Nora asked. Elara looked at her steadily. The girl's chin was up. She was braced for consequence, and the bracing looked so familiar, that particular posture of someone who expects to be punished for an honest mistake, that something in Elara's chest contracted sharply. "No," she said. "It was an accident and you weren't hurt, and I'd say the horse learned something too." Nora stared at her for a long moment. Then she said with great seriousness, "Mrs. Whitfield would have told him." "I'm not Mrs. Whitfield," Elara said. Something changed in Nora's eyes, not warmth yet, not enough for warmth, but something like consideration, the reassessment of a position. They saddled the roan together. Elara stayed at his head and talked to him in a low voice, mostly nonsense, and Nora worked with the quiet competence she'd been showing Elara all week. And when it was done and the horse stood calm and ready, Nora looked at her with something that might eventually become trust. "You ride in German or English?" Nora asked. Elara laughed. It came out surprised, and she didn't try to stop it. "Both," she said, "depending on the horse." On the 8th day, the stranger came to town. She almost missed him. She had ridden in with Cornish for supplies, her first time back to Dusthaven, sitting up on the wagon bench beside him in the morning light, and she'd noticed how the town adjusted itself as they passed through, the way people looked at them and at each other with the quick, signifying glances of a small community processing new information. She was becoming real to them. She was becoming a fact. She was in the general store choosing thread when she saw him through the window. He was not remarkable to look at. That was intentional, she knew. Medium height, medium build, brown coat, hat pulled to the right angle. He was standing at the far end of the street reading a notice board, but he wasn't reading. His eyes were moving too much for reading, quartering the street with the practiced efficiency of a man paid to notice things. She had seen him before, not here, in St. Louis, standing outside the Voss family's offices on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks before Edmund died. She put the thread down carefully and kept her face entirely still. He hadn't seen her yet. He was looking down the street toward the saloon. She paid for what was in her basket and walked out of the general store and crossed to where Cole Maddox was loading a bag of grain onto the wagon. "I need to go back now," she said quietly. He looked at her. She knew her face had given something away because his went careful. "All right," he said without asking anything. They were out of town in 10 minutes. She rode beside him in silence for the first mile, and then she said, "I need to tell you something, not all of it yet, but enough." "Tell me what you need to," he said. She looked straight ahead. The mesa was red in the morning light and the sky was the deep October blue she was already beginning to think of as hers, and she said, "My husband Edmund Voss died in April. He was said to have died of a heart condition." She paused. He didn't. Cole said nothing. He kept his eyes on the road. Edmund discovered that money had been diverted from a public trust fund. Significant money. The kind of money that has consequences when it goes missing. She pressed her hand against the cedar box in her lap. "Before he died, he gave me certain documents. He told me to keep them and be careful. He did not tell me what was in them because there wasn't time." Another pause. 3 weeks after he died, I opened the box. "What was in it?" Cole asked. "Correspondence, financial records, names." She exhaled slowly. "The man responsible for the diversion is my brother-in-law, Judge Harlan Voss of the Missouri Circuit Court." Cole was quiet for a long enough time that she wondered if she'd said too much. "And you came here," he said finally. "I needed to go somewhere." Harlan wouldn't look immediately. "Somewhere I had a legitimate reason to be." She kept her voice level. I was not expecting to find a household that needed anything other than a wife. I underestimated what I was walking into." "You were running," he said, not accusatory, simply naming the thing. "Yes," she said. He didn't speak again for another quarter mile. She watched the road. She was already calculating what she would do if he turned the wagon around, if he told her to go back to the station, if he decided this was too much for 40 acres of land and a practical arrangement. "The man in town," quotes him, "a private investigator. I believe Harlan hired him." She paused. "He may not know exactly where I am, but if he's in Dusthaven, it won't take long." Cole brought the wagon to a stop on the crest of a low-rise. Below them, the ranch was visible, small and solid and real against the red earth. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "How dangerous is this?" he asked. She thought about Harlan Voss, about the way he had stood at Edmund's funeral in his black suit with the judicial composure of a man certain of his own righteousness, and looked at her across the grave, and she had seen in his eyes the precise moment he'd registered that she might be a problem. "Very," she said. Cole looked at the ranch again. "You should have told me this before you came," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "I should have. But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and think about whether you trusted me enough to tell me at all." She looked at him. He was still watching the ranch below. "Yes," she said. He picked up the reins. He clicked his tongue at the horses, and they started moving again down toward the buildings and the corral and the windmill turning in the wind. "Is there anything in that box that helps you?" he said. "Anything that could be used? If it got to the right court, the right judge, yes. Harlan has a great deal of power within Missouri, but federal jurisdiction is different." "How do you get it to a federal judge?" "Very carefully," she said. He said nothing more until they reached the barn. When he helped her down from the wagon the first time he had touched her at all, a brief and businesslike steadying of her arm, he held on for a fraction of a second longer than was necessary, and then he released her and took the horses' heads and led them in without looking back. She stood in the yard and breathed. That evening, after Nora was in bed and Claire had gone back to her own house in town, there were limits to the intimacy of the arrangement apparently, and nighttime was one of them. Cole came to the kitchen table with a lamp and sat across from her. He had the cedar box in front of him. She had left it in her room. She had been careful with it. She realized, looking at it on the table between them, with a cold clarity, she had left her door unlocked because she was not used to having a locked door. "I didn't open it," he said. She looked from the box to his face. He met her eyes directly, and there was something in his expression that was not comfortable, that was in fact the expression of a man confronting something about himself he didn't much like. "I found it when I went to move your bags out of the way," he said. I was going to fix the chair in your room. The leg's been loose, he paused. I picked it up. I thought about opening it. Another pause. I didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you told me something hard today, he said. And it seemed right to tell you something honest in return. He set the box closer to her side of the table. This marriage, what it is, what it might become, it won't work if we don't tell each other the truth, whatever the truth is. She put her hand on the box. My husband, as she said slowly, was the kind of man who said the right thing and then told me very carefully what I was not allowed to do or say or know. She looked at the lamp flame rather than at Cole. He was not violent. He was never violent. He was just a door that locked from the outside. I came here because I needed somewhere to breathe and somewhere that Harlan couldn't find me easily. I told myself that was practical, and that was fine. She met Cole's eyes. It was practical, but I am starting to think I might also want something more than practical, and that frightens me considerably. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the desert was dark and the stars were enormous. You don't have to decide anything, Cole said, about any of it. No, she said. I know. He looked at the box. Is there anything I can do to help with what you're carrying? She thought about it seriously because he deserved a serious answer. There's a lawyer in Santa Fe, she said. A federal attorney named Aldrich. He's the kind of man Harlan can't reach. If I could get a message to him officially with documentation, it would matter. I know a man who rides the Santa Fe twice monthly, Cole said. He's trustworthy. Then that, she said, it would help. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, speaking carefully and honestly about practical things. The water rights dispute, the investigator in town, what Harlan Voss was likely to do when he located her. Cole listened in a way that was unusual, completely without preparing his response while she was still talking, and he asked good questions and offered what he knew without embellishment. When she finally stood to go to bed, she took the cedar box from the table. At the doorway, she paused. Cole, she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name. She felt it in the air between them, that small shift. Yes, he said. Thank you for not opening it, she said. It matters to me. He looked at her steadily, and in the lamplight his face was less guarded than she had yet seen it, and she saw what he was. Not a man without feeling, but a man who had taught himself to keep feeling at a considerable distance. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's going to need working through. She went down the hall to her east-facing room and set the box beside the bed and lay down in the dark and listened to the desert, and she thought I told him almost everything. And the walls did not close in. She had never told anyone anything, and had the walls stay where they were. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep. She did not sleep well that night, and she knew it was not Harlan that kept her awake. It was the box. Not its contents. She had long since made her peace with what was in it, had sorted it and organized it and annotated it and made it as useful as a collection of damning correspondence could be made. It was the fact of it on the table unlocked in the lamplight of Cole's kitchen, present between them, like a third person at the table. The fact that she had told him as much as she had. She had told people things before. She had told the lawyer in Cincinnati, though, that had been transactional. Here are documents, guard them. Wait for my word. She had told no one else. Not in St. Louis, not in the weeks of preparation for her departure, not in the careful letter she had written to Cole Maddox's advertisement, which had given him her useful qualities and her grief and her desire for a practical arrangement, and had not for obvious reasons mentioned any of the rest. She had told him because she had seen the investigator through the glass of the general store window, and the world had narrowed to the specific dimensions of an immediate problem, and telling Cole had been part of solving it. That was what she told herself. But she also knew that she had told him because, in the kitchen that afternoon, watching him read the survey documents she'd reorganized, she had felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of marriage to a man who said she was exceptional. The sense of being looked at by someone who saw what was actually there and considered it worth something. This was dangerous. She had cataloged it and kept it at arm's length, and then she had told him about Harlan anyway. She turned over in the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. She thought about what he had said on the wagon road when she told him about Edmund and the box and Judge Harlan Voss. He had listened until she was finished, and then he had said, "But you didn't because you needed to go somewhere first and think about whether you trusted me enough to tell me at all." Not a question, a statement of understanding so accurate. It had caught her off guard because she had not known herself well enough to name what she had been doing, And here was a man she had known for 8 days who had named it for her without being asked. She pressed her hand against the cedar box beside the bed. In the morning, she would be practical again. She would organize the documents and think carefully about the message to Aldrich and consider what the investigator in town might be reporting to Harlan and what that meant for the timeline. She was good at morning. She was good at practicality. It was only at night when the work was finished and the house was quiet that she could feel the shape of all the things she wasn't letting herself want. She kept her hand on the box. She listened to the desert. She waited for morning to make her practical again. The days that followed had a particular quality that she didn't have words for. She had not had many experiences to provide vocabulary for it. The quality of two people engaged in the slow process of genuinely knowing each other, neither hurrying it nor holding it back, simply letting it happen at the pace of daily life. She learned that Cole made a specific face when something in the accounts was wrong, a slight narrowing around the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening of one corner of his mouth. She learned that Nora hummed to herself while she worked. Never the same thing twice, always something incomplete, and that Cole always looked toward the sound when he heard it the way a man looks toward a fire. She learned that the horses in the South Corral were all named after geographic features. The roan was Mesa, the bay was Rio, the gray Cole favored was Blanco, and that Cole had named them without self-consciousness in the same way he did most things simply because it made practical sense. She was thinking about this, about the particular simplicity of a man who named horses after the landscape he loved when she went into the barn one afternoon and found him sitting on a hay bale with a letter in his hand, and his face was the face of someone who has just been told something that doesn't surprise them, but hits them hard regardless. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. He considered. She could see the consideration, the habitual instinct to say nothing, and then he held the letter out. She took it and read it. It was from the Hartfield Cattle Company's lawyer. It was precisely worded and very polite, and it informed Cole Maddox that in light of the territorial court's decision regarding the Petticoat Basin water rights, the company intended to exercise its easement claims on the Northwater access, effective first of the new year, which would require him to reroute the primary irrigation to his south pasture at his own expense, a cost that the letter acknowledged was significant and expressed sympathy for. "When did this come?" she said. "Today," he said. She read it again. "This is the document I found the discrepancy in," she said. "The date in the easement filing doesn't match the territorial register." "I know," he said, "but knowing isn't the same as proving, and the court has already ruled." "Which court?" He looked at her. "Circuit," he said. She felt a cold clarity settle through her, the same clarity she'd felt looking through the glass of the general store. "Harlan's jurisdiction extends to New Mexico territory," she said, not quite a question. "Apparently," Cole said, "as of 3 months ago." They looked at each other in the barn, with the afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards and the horses moving quietly in their stalls. "Cole," she said, "is the date on this ruling before or after the date I found the discrepancy in the easement filing?" He frowned. "After." "Then the court ruled on a document that was already demonstrably altered," she said. "Which means the ruling is based on fraud." She paused. "Which is exactly the kind of thing a federal case would be interested in." He was quiet for a moment. "You think Harlan is here already," he said. "Not just because of you. I think Harlan is everywhere. His interests require him to be," she said. "And I think this water rights case became his interest the moment someone offered him something for it." She handed the letter back. "This is good, actually." "It doesn't feel good," he said. "No, but it connects things. It gives Aldrich a second line of evidence that isn't just about Edmund." She looked at the horses. "It means I'm not the only one Harlan needs to manage. It means the federal case has a local dimension that Dusthaven will actually care about." Cole looked at the letter. "You're doing it again," he said. "Doing what?" "Finding the angle that makes things workable," he said. "Even the bad things." She looked at him surprised. "It's a habit," she said. "I know." He folded the letter. "I mean it as I mean to say I find it useful. To be around." He stopped as though the words had come out slightly differently than he'd intended them and looked away. She did not make anything of it. She was learning the grammar of a man who said things sideways sometimes, who approached the true statement by way of the approximate one and hoped you were paying attention. She was paying attention. October turned towards November, and the light changed over the mesa. Lower, sharper, the kind of light that makes shadows long and blue and very still. Elara learned the specific shape of each day on the Maddox ranch, the way she had once learned the layout of a house that was not hers, by moving through it until it began against all expectation to feel like it was. She rode out with Wold most mornings now. This had not been agreed upon so much as it had accumulated. She appeared at the barn, he saddled a horse for her, they went. Conversation was not required. She had spent 3 years of marriage performing conversation for an audience, and Cole Maddox's comfortable silence was something she was beginning to regard as a form of respect, or at least of decency. On the mornings she didn't ride out, she worked at the kitchen table with the survey maps and the territorial records, building a case about the water rights that was slow and thorough and required patience. She had patience. She had cultivated it the way other women cultivated gardens, out of necessity, because the alternative was despair. Clara Whitfield watched all of this with the careful attention of a woman who sees her position eroding by inches and is not yet sure what to do about it. She was not unkind to Elara. She was not cold. She was something more complicated, a woman who had invested 8 months of herself in a possibility that was now becoming less possible by the day, and who was handling this with the pride and the pain of someone who refuses to be pitied. Elara found herself somewhat against her inclination respecting this. It would have been easier if Clara were simpler, petty, or manipulative, or obviously unsuitable. Instead, she was good. She was genuinely good, patient with Nora, helpful without being servile, honest in her opinions. She had clearly cared for this household through months when Cole had been stretched thin and the care had been real, which meant that what was happening between them, this slow daily replacement, was genuinely hard, and Elara held that hard thing with more care than she had expected to. The message had been sent to Santa Fe through Cole's contact, a taciturn man named Gideon, who rode the route twice a month and kept his own counsel. They had 2 weeks, perhaps 3, before a response could come. In the meantime, Elara watched the main street of Dusthaven each time they went in for supplies. And twice she thought she saw the investigator, a different angle, a different coat. And once she was sure of it, and that night she lay awake running through possibilities, the way she had learned to do in the last months of her marriage, when sleep had been difficult and the house felt like a closing fist. It was Nora who changed things, as Elara had always suspected it would be. The girl had been thawing incrementally, small deposits of trust, easily withdrawn, carefully offered. She had shown Elara the horse she'd raised from a foal. She had asked one evening for help with German vocabulary for a school exercise. She had started occasionally to sit in the kitchen while Elara worked in the mornings, not talking, simply being present in the comfortable way of a child who has decided a particular adult is safe to be near. The day of the coyote was the day it broke through. They had ridden out together, all 3 of them, Cole and Elara and Nora, on her small roan to check the north fence line. It was a bright, cold November morning, the kind that exists only in high desert, clear and hard as glass. They had found 2 fence posts down and repaired them, and they were heading back when Nora's horse stopped dead and refused to go forward. In the brush 30 yards ahead, moving wrong. The coyote was injured a back leg at an angle that meant no good end for it, its movements slow and desperate. Nora had seen it. Her face went through something complex very quickly, that particular collision of a child's softness and the frontier's unsentimental reality. Cole began to reach for the rifle on his saddle. "Wait," Nora said. Her voice was very small and very serious. Cole waited. Nora sat on her roan and looked at the coyote in the brush for a long moment. Then she said, "Is there anything that can be done?" The silence that followed had a weight to it. Elara watched Cole's face, the particular tension of a father who knows the true answer and loves his daughter enough to feel the cost of giving it. "No," he said, "not for an animal with that kind of injury, not out here." Nora nodded once, a very precise and adult nod. "All right," she said. She turned her horse and rode slowly ahead, out of sight of the brush. Elara followed, leaving Cole to do what was necessary. When the sound came, Nora's shoulders went rigid for one moment and then released, and she sat her horse in the narrow winter sun and looked straight ahead. They rode back to the ranch without speaking. That evening after dinner, Elara was washing the dishes alone. Cole was in the barn with a horse that had thrown a shoe. Clara had gone home when she heard the sound from Nora's room. A small sound, the kind of sound that is trying very hard to be nothing. She dried her hands. She went down the hall. She did not knock loudly. She tapped twice softly and said, "It's Elara. I'm not coming in unless you want me to." A silence. "Then you can come in." The room was small and warm, with a rag rug on the floor and a shelf of carefully arranged objects, a rock collection, a pressed flower, a small carved horse, and Nora was sitting on her bed in her nightgown, very upright, with the stubborn set to her jaw and her eyes red. I know it's foolish, Nora said. It's a coyote. It's not foolish, Elara said. She did not go to the bed immediately. She sat down on the floor near the door back against the wall, which put her below Nora's eye level. Caring about things that are hurt is not foolish. It's the beginning of being a decent person. Nora looked down at her. The calculation was still running Nora's default mode, but underneath it was simply a child who had had a hard day. Will it always feel this way, she asked. When things die? Yes, Elara said. If you're the right kind of person, it will always feel like something. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then with the sideways approach of a child reaching for something indirect. Do you miss your husband? Elara thought about Edmund. She thought about this honestly, which she had not allowed herself to do in some time. I miss who I thought he might be, she said slowly. I don't think I ever entirely knew him. Did he love you? The question was very direct, and Elara considered it seriously. I believe he thought he did, she said. In the way that people love things they want to keep rather than people they want to know. Nora absorbed this in silence for a moment. My mama left, she said then. So quietly it was almost nothing. Elara went very still. Papa says she died, Nora said in a voice that was careful and controlled in a way that no 8-year-old's voice should be. But she didn't. I know she didn't because Mrs. Hennessy at the church told her daughter, and her daughter told Alice Bryce, and Alice Bryce told me. She looked at her hands. Mama went away with a man from Albuquerque. Papa told people she was sick. He said she died. The room was very quiet. Elara could hear the wind outside and faintly the sounds from the barn. I've known for 4 months, Nora said. I haven't told Papa I know. Elara sat on the floor of the child's room and breathed slowly and thought about Cole Maddox and the story he'd built around a wound too large to carry in public. And she thought about Nora carrying this particular piece of knowledge. Her father's lie, her mother's choice alone for 4 months, with the stoic endurance of a child who has no one to hand it to. That's a very heavy thing to carry by yourself, Elara said. Yes, Nora said simply. Do you want to know why your father told people she died? I think so. I think, Elara said carefully, that he was trying to protect you from people's opinions about your mama and from having to explain something that hurts. She paused. It was also probably protecting himself. People do that. They build stories around the things that break them because the breaking is too hard to show. Nora thought about this. Is that wrong? It's human, Elara said. Wrong and human are not always the same. Are you going to tell him I know? No, Elara said. That's yours to tell when you decide whether you want to. Another silence longer this time, with the quality of something settling. Elara, Nora said, then using the name for the first time without Mrs. Voss in front of it. Yes, I'm glad you came. Elara sat on the floor of the small room and looked at this child, this serious and solitary child with her rock collection and her carved horse and her 4 months of carried knowledge, and she felt something move in her chest that was not practicality and was not strategic thinking and was not any of the useful calculated things she had been relying on since April. I'm glad too, she said, and meant it completely. She stayed until Nora was asleep, which did not take long after that. Then she went back to the kitchen and stood at the window looking out at the dark yard, and she heard Cole come in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her standing there. He read something in her face. What's wrong, he had said. She turned to look at him. He was backlit from the hall lamp, and his face was in shadow, but she could see the tension in his posture, the readiness of a man who expects bad news. Nothing's wrong, she said. Nora's asleep. A pause. I want to talk to you about something. He came in and sat down. She sat across from him, the same positions as the night she had told him about Harlan. Nora knows, she said, about her mother. Cole's face went through something that was very hard to watch. The color drained from it, and his hands went flat on the table. Not a gesture of control, exactly more like a man reaching for the surface of something. She's known for 4 months, Elara said. She's been carrying it by herself. He said nothing. His jaw was very tight. I'm not telling you this to reproach you, she said. I know why you told people she died. I understand it. She looked at him steadily. But your daughter has been living with a secret for 4 months because she's been trying to protect you from knowing that she knows it, and she's 8 years old, and that's too much. The kitchen clock ticked. How is she, he said. His voice was rough. She cried a little, Elara said. She's all right. She's very strong. She's too strong, he said, and his voice broke on the last word just slightly, just enough. She's been too strong her whole life because I couldn't, he stopped. You were broken, Elara said quietly. People who are broken do what they can. You built a story because the real story was too much. He looked at her sharply. I'm not absolving you, she said. I'm explaining you. There's a difference. He looked down at his hands. Eleanor Nora's mother didn't leave for the reasons most people leave, he said. He seemed to be making a decision with each word. She left because I wasn't here. Even when I was here, I came back from the war and I put everything into this land and I wasn't. He stopped again. She tried to tell me for 2 years and I didn't hear it, and then she was gone. The wind moved outside. She took nothing that was Nora's, he said. She sent a letter from Albuquerque. She said she was sorry. She said she'd never been suited for the frontier. A pause. She wasn't wrong. I'd known she wasn't when I married her, and I thought love was enough to bridge the gap. He looked up. It wasn't. No, Elara said. It rarely is on its own. He was quiet for a long moment. You're not like her, he said. Not as a compliment, exactly as an observation. As the naming of a fact he'd been sitting with for a while. No, she agreed. You're suited for this, he said. For the desert. For all of it. The work and the difficulty and the... He seemed to run out of words. He shook his head slightly. Outside, the stars were brilliant and cold, and the mesa was dark, and the windmill was turning in the night wind. Cole, she said. It came easily now. You need to talk to Nora, not to confess the whole story, not all at once, but to let her know that you know she knows. So she doesn't have to be the only one holding it. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. Good, she said and stood up. He looked up at her from the table. The lamplight was warm and his face was open in a way it hadn't been when she arrived, stripped of its habitual management, showing the actual topography of it. The loneliness that had settled in there like a second tenant. The capacity for feeling that he'd been carefully misdirecting into land and work and the maintenance of things that couldn't leave. Why are you doing this, he said. Not suspicious, genuinely asking. She thought about it. Because someone should have done it for me, she said at last, and didn't. She went to her room. She lay in the dark and listened to the desert and pressed one hand to the cedar box beside her bed and thought about Nora's face when she had said, I'm glad you came, and she thought about how the walls of this small east-facing room still stood where they were. She thought about Cole's face at the kitchen table, open and unmanaged and saying more without words than Edmund had said in 3 years of Sundays with his flowers and his careful rules. She was not safe yet. Harlan would come, or he would send someone, and the investigator in Dusthaven was still asking questions she could feel like a current under the town's surface. The box was still locked. The federal lawyer had not yet replied. But in this room that faced east, with a child asleep down the hall, and a man sitting alone in a kitchen, working up the courage to speak truly to his daughter, Elara Voss pressed her hand to the cedar box and felt something that she identified after a moment's careful examination as hope. Not safety, not certainty, nothing as reliable as either of those. Just hope. It was more than she had had when she stepped off the train. She would take it. November settled over the Maddox ranch like a hand-pressed flat. The mornings went from cool to cold. The afternoons shortened and the light took on a specific quality. She was beginning to love the way it came in low from the south and made the red earth almost orange, and how at midday the shadows disappeared entirely, and the world existed in a hard, bright uniformity that had its own beauty, austere and uncompromising. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks. The word home had not occurred to her in relation to it, but she noticed that when they rode back from supply runs in Dusthaven, something in her chest settled as the buildings came into view over the rise, and she was honest enough with herself to know what that settling was, even if she wasn't yet ready to call it by its name. Clara Whitfield came every morning and left after dinner, and the arrangement between the three of them had achieved a kind of uneasy stability that was not comfortable but was at least workable. Clara was intelligent, and she was in her own way fair-minded, and she had clearly arrived at some assessment of the situation that was less combative than it might have been. She still brought her small improvements to the house, a new jar for the windowsill, an alteration to the menu, but they felt less like territorial claims now, and more like what they actually were, the habits of a woman who had organized herself around a particular life and was slowly beginning to reorganize. She had heard Clara ask Cole one morning about his cousin's ranch in Kansas. She had heard Cole say that it was doing well as far as he knew. She had not made anything of this, but she had filed it in the way she filed everything. The evenings were different now. After Nora was in bed and Clara had gone and the house was theirs, which was how she had started to think of it, though she hadn't examined this too closely, she and Cole sat at the kitchen table and talked. Not about the water rights, not about Harlan's investigator, not always about anything practical at all. He told her about the war in the way men who have been in a war sometimes tell it obliquely in pieces, the small details that stand in for the larger ones. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's shop, about learning to read clocks before she learned to read words, because the clock shop was where she spent her days. She told him about the smell of metal and oil and the particular German precision of her father's work, and he listened with the stillness she had come to rely on. She told him one evening about the Sundays in St. Louis. Edmund had physicians and their wives every Sunday, she said. 14 people, sometimes 20. Beautiful dinners. He was a very good host. She looked at the lamp. He would introduce me to people and say, "My wife reads German philosophy." He said it the way you'd say, "My wife plays the piano," like it was a decoration. She paused. I learned not to speak about what I'd read in his presence after the first year. It made the evenings easier. Cole was quiet for a moment. "What did you read?" he said. She looked at him. He was watching her across the table with his full attention, which she still sometimes forgot to expect. "Kant mostly," she said. "Some Schopenhauer. Hegel in translation, though my German was good enough for the original." She felt something almost like shyness. "My father thought women who read philosophy were either very strong or heading for trouble. He wasn't wrong about either, as it turned out." "What did you think of Kant?" Cole said. She looked at him for a long moment, because this was not a question she had been asked since her father's shop. "I think he understood duty very well," she said, "and desire very poorly, and that this is a common problem in people who are mainly interested in how things should work rather than how they actually work." Cole considered this. "And how do things actually work?" he said. "Messily," she said, "and better for it, I think. The clean systems always leave something out." He looked down at his coffee. Something moved in his expression, that private recalibration she was learning to read. "I didn't have much school," he said. "Enough to read and cipher. The war happened when I was 22, and after that there wasn't a great deal of time for systems." He said the word with a kind of dry acknowledgement. "But I've noticed what you said, that the clean arrangements tend to miss things." "What things do they miss?" she asked. He looked up at her. "People," he said, "mostly." She sat with that for a moment. "Yes," she said, "mostly people." Outside the window the desert was dark and the stars were very bright, and the windmill was turning in the night breeze. And she sat at the kitchen table with a man who read nothing and had noticed everything and thought about all the Sundays in St. Louis with the physicians and their wives, and thought, "I wasted so much time in the wrong room." Cole began to talk to Nora in the gradual and careful way that she had suggested, and she witnessed this from the respectful distance that it required, and what she saw moved her more than she expected. He was not eloquent. He did not have the words for the kind of conversation he was trying to have, but he had the honesty, and honesty turned out to be enough. He told Nora one evening at bedtime that he knew she had learned the truth about her mother, and that he was sorry for the lie, and that the lie had been wrong, even though he had meant it as a protection. Nora had said, "I know, Papa." And Cole had said, "Are you angry?" And Nora had thought about it seriously in the way she thought about everything, and then said, "Not at you, at the situation." And Cole had said, "That seems right." Elara had heard this through the closed door of the hall, not by intention, but because the house was small and she had stood very still with her hand against the wall, and she had thought, that is a man learning how to do a thing he didn't know how to do and doing it imperfectly and honestly. And this is what it looks like when someone tries. She had not seen much of that in her life, in the specific form of a man trying, and she found it enormously difficult not to love it. She was going to have to be careful about that. The investigator had not been visible in Dusthaven for 4 days, and this worried her more than his presence had. Absence was not the same as absence. She had written again to Bauer in Cincinnati, confirming receipt, confirming the chain of custody for the originals. She had heard nothing more from Santa Fe. She counted the days and ran the numbers and told herself that 3 weeks was not an unreasonable time for a response given the distances and the mail routes. She counted the days and she learned the horses, and she read Kant's categorical imperative to Nora one evening by request. Nora had asked about German philosophy after Elara mentioned it, with the characteristic directness of a child who has never been told that her curiosity is inconvenient. And she sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with Cole, and talked about things that had nothing to do with Harlan in the box, and she felt something building in her that was not practical and not strategic and not anything she had a good name for yet. She was beginning to suspect it was a life. She had not expected that. She had not allowed herself to expect that. She thought about Kant and his clean systems and his insufficient attention to desire, and she thought he was right that duty matters. He was wrong that it was the only thing. Judge Elara Voss arrived in Dusthaven on a Thursday. Elara knew before she saw him. She felt it in the quality of the morning, the way Cole came in from the barn without speaking, the way Nora ate her breakfast in silence, the way the wind was wrong. She had spent enough time in the company of dread to recognize it arriving ahead of its cause. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon. He came with two men she didn't know. Not the investigator, someone new and with the particular air of a man who has prepared for an encounter and is confident in his preparation. Elara Voss was 61 years old with the imposing physicality of a man who had been very handsome at 40 and was not entirely reconciled to 60. He wore a black coat and a judge's unconscious authority, and when he rode into the yard, he brought with him the specific atmosphere of her dead husband's house in St. Louis, the sense that here was a man who had decided what the outcome would be before the conversation began. Cole was at the corral. He saw the riders come in, and he closed the gate and walked toward them unhurried. Elara watched from the kitchen window. Her hands were steady. She had been preparing for this for 6 weeks since the morning she had stepped off the train and understood that time was not unlimited. She went out. "Elara," Harlan said when he saw her come through the door. He said her name the way he always had, with a warmth that was entirely performative, the vocal equivalent of a hand extended while the other held a knife. "There you are. We've all been terribly worried." "Harlan," she said. Cole had stopped at the edge of the yard, equidistant between her and the riders, with his hat pushed back on his head and his face showing nothing useful. He was watching Harlan with the specific attention of a man who is calculating something. "I've come to bring you home," Harlan said. "Back to St. Louis, to your family." He looked at Cole with the brief appraisal of a man dismissing something. "This arrangement was entered into in a moment of grief. No one blames you. Edmund's death was hard on everyone." "Edmund's death," Elara said, "was harder on Edmund than on anyone else." A brief pause. "Of course," Harlan said smoothly. "That's what I meant. You were in shock. You made a decision that—" "I made a decision that I stand behind," she said. "Elara." His voice hardened just slightly, just enough that she could hear the boundary of the performance where it met the actual man. "I have with me paperwork. Edmund's estate still requires administration. There are matters that need your signature in person in Missouri. The court requires it." She had expected this. She had prepared for this specific lie. "What court?" she asked. He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "The Missouri Circuit, my court." "I see," she said, "and the matter that requires my personal appearance." "Estate inventory," he said. "Some questions about documents Edmund may have had at home. Family records. You would know where he kept things." The yard was very quiet. Cole had not moved. "I've brought the appropriate papers," Harlan said, and produced an envelope from his coat. He held it toward her. "Legal requirement, you understand." Bomb. She looked at the envelope and did not take it. "Sheriff Turner can verify the legitimacy," Harlan said, his voice carrying to the whole yard now. "I spoke with him this morning. He's a reasonable man." Something cold moved through Elara's chest. Sheriff Turner. She had not expected Harlan to move so quickly to know the local power structure so well. Cole's voice came from behind her. "He's right that he spoke with Sheriff Turner." She turned. Cole was looking at her and his face had a careful tension. She recognized as the expression of a man who has a thing to say that he doesn't want to say. "Turner rode out this morning while you were at the survey maps," he said. "He told me Elara Voss had come to town and had paperwork and that I should cooperate." A pause. "Turner's a company man. Hartfield Cattle Company owns the water rights he's been backing against me. I should have told you." "Cooperate," Harlan repeated pleasantly. "A reasonable word." Elara stood in the yard and looked from Cole to Harlan and back, and she was very aware of the cedar box inside the house behind her and the $342 sewn into her petticoat, no less. Now she had spent some, and she was calculating, in the way she had always calculated, fast and cold, what the options were and which ones remained. The options were fewer than she would have liked. She had no federal response yet from Santa Fe. She had no official legal status in the territory. The marriage had been contracted but not formalized. She had a box of evidence that was powerful only in the right hands, and the right hands were not here. "All right," she said. Cole looked at her. "I'll come into town," she said. "I'll speak with Sheriff Turner. I understand that's the appropriate process." She looked at Harlan steadily. "Give me an hour to collect my things." Harlan's expression warmed with the satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted. "Of course. Take your time." She went inside. Cole followed her, which Harlan permitted with the confidence of a man who didn't consider Cole Maddox a meaningful obstacle. In the kitchen with the door closed, Cole said quietly, "You're not actually going to go with him." "No," she said, "but I need to get to that box before he does, and I need to get dressed, and I need you to listen to me very carefully for the next 3 minutes." He leaned against the counter and crossed his arms and listened. She spoke quickly and quietly, and he did not interrupt. "The evidence in the box is copies," she said. "Not the originals. I was careful. The originals are with a lawyer in Cincinnati, a man named Bauer, who was my father's attorney, who I sent them to the week after I left St. Louis. Harlan doesn't know that. He thinks I have the only copies. If I give him what's in the box, he thinks he's safe." "But he's not," Cole said. "The documents in Cincinnati are enough for a federal case. They've always been enough." She was moving as she spoke, going to her room, taking the cedar box from beside the bed. "I've been waiting for the response from Santa Fe because it's faster, but I don't need it to be safe. I need Harlan to think he's won long enough for me to get a message to Cincinnati." "How does going to town help with that?" "It doesn't," she said. "Going to town puts me in a jail cell and gives Harlan access to whatever papers he can convince Turner to find in this house. I need you to get me out of here before that happens." She looked at him. "Is there another route off this property, one that doesn't go through town now?" "South Road one," he said. "Goes out toward the Alvarado spread. Takes longer, but you can hit the stage road about 12 miles out." "Where does the stage go?" "Eastbound to Albuquerque. Connects to Santa Fe." "That's where I need to go." She pulled a piece of paper from her dress pocket. She'd been carrying it for days prepared, and held it out. "That's the lawyer's name in Cincinnati and the federal attorney in Santa Fe. If you can get a wire to either of them, to both of them, tell them where I'm going and what's happening. Aldrich in Santa Fe will move fast if he knows Harlan is here." Cole took the paper and looked at it. "I can send the wire from the Alvarado place," he said. "Theo Alvarado has a telegraph." He folded the paper. "I can ride with you to the South Road." "No," she said, "you need to stay here. Nora is here." "Nora is at the schoolhouse," he said. "Until 4 o'clock. It's 2:30 now." A pause. She watched him do the calculation. "You can't ride to the stage road alone," he said. "I've ridden alone before. Not with Harlan's men in the yard." This was a fair point. "I can ask Prentice," she said. "He knows these roads. He works for Hartfield," Cole said. "Turner bought him 3 years ago." She stood with the cedar box and thought. The options were narrowing with every passing minute, and she knew Harlan's patience outside in the yard had a specific limit. "I'll take the box and go now," she said. "Out the back, through the corral. I can—" "Elara." His voice stopped her. It was the particular tone of a man who has made a decision that is going to cost him something. "Get on the horse." She looked at him. "The bay in the south corral," he said. "She's fast and she's good on rough ground. I'll go out and tell Harlan you're taking your time and that I'll bring you in myself." He met her eyes. "That'll give you 20 minutes, maybe 30. The South Road meets the Alvarado boundary in about 4 miles. Follow the ridge until you see the windmill." "And you?" "I'll handle Harlan," he said. "Harlan has men and he has the sheriff." "He has the local sheriff," Cole said. "He doesn't have me." Something moved in his expression, not recklessness, not bravado. Something more grounded than either of those. "This is my land. These are my roads. He can wave his papers all he likes, but he doesn't know this ground, and I do." He looked at her. "Go." She went. She took the box and her bag with the $300 remaining, and she went out the back door and through the kitchen garden and through the gap in the fence she'd noticed on her second day, because she always noticed gaps in fences. The bay was in the South Corral, a long-legged animal with the calm alertness of a horse that has been well handled, and Elara saddled her with the efficient speed of a woman who had spent weeks watching Cole saddle horses and had paid attention. She was through the south gate and on the road before the 30 minutes were up. She rode hard for the first mile, then settled into a pace that was fast but sustainable. The desert opened up around her, enormous and red and indifferent, the same desert she'd looked out at from the train 6 weeks ago, which had seemed alien then and felt like hers now in some fundamental way she couldn't entirely account for. The box was strapped to the saddle. The ridgeline was to her left. The windmill was not yet visible. She thought about Cole Maddox standing in his yard telling Harlan Voss to wait. She thought about what that was going to cost him. She rode. The windmill appeared in the late afternoon light, white and turning against the darkening sky. The Alvarado place was a larger operation than Cole's, a low hacienda-style building with outbuildings spreading wide. She rode in at a walk, and a Mexican vaquero came out from the barn and regarded her with the careful assessment of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors. "Theo Alvarado," she said, "I need to speak with him, and I need to use your telegraph." The vaquero looked at her for a moment. "Tell him it concerns Cole Maddox," she said. The man turned and went inside. Theo Alvarado was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with a face that had been serious for a long time, and he listened to what she told him with the still attention of someone who was very experienced at deciding who to trust and was doing it now quickly. "Cole Maddox is a good man," he said when she had finished. "Yes," she said. "What do you need?" "The telegraph," she said, "first, and then whatever you can tell me about the fastest route to Santa Fe that doesn't go through Dusthaven." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Come inside," he said. She sent 2 wires, one to Aldrich in Santa Fe, one to Bauer in Cincinnati, and she wrote them with the precise economy of someone who knows that words sent at long distance must count. Then she sat in Theo Alvarado's kitchen and drank coffee and did not ask anyone to reassure her, because she had learned that reassurance freely given was often worth nothing. She thought about Nora coming home from school at 4 o'clock. She thought about a man standing in a yard with no warrant and no federal authority, and the kind of calm that comes not from fearlessness, but from having decided what he was willing to lose. She thought about a cedar box full of copies. An hour later, Theo Alvarado told her there was a response from Santa Fe. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at the ceiling of a stranger's kitchen in the New Mexico desert, and she breathed. Attorney Aldrich was already moving. He had, it transpired, been waiting for her contact. Gideon's message from 2 weeks earlier had reached him, and he had been preparing. He had federal jurisdiction. He had a judge who was not Harlan Voss or anyone Harlan owned. He was coming to Dusthaven. He would be there in 3 days. She looked at Theo Alvarado. "I need to go back," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You just came from there." "I know," she said. "The men with your brother-in-law are still there." "Yes," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood up. "I'll ride with you," he said. She thought about arguing. She thought about Nora and Cole and the specific weight of going back to a place where the danger was, because the place itself mattered too much to abandon. "Thank you," she said. She rode through the late afternoon with Theo Alvarado's men flanking her and the mesa going dark ahead, and she thought about what she was doing and why. She could keep riding. She had enough money for the stage, and the stage would take her to Albuquerque, and from Albuquerque she could go east or west or anywhere she chose, and she would be gone from Dusthaven before Harlan had any idea she had slipped his net. The federal case could proceed without her. Bauer in Cincinnati had the documents. Aldrich was already moving. She was not strictly speaking necessary. She thought about this seriously and honestly, the way she tried to think about everything that mattered. Then she thought about Nora coming home from school at 4 o'clock. She thought about Cole standing in the yard with Harlan's men around him, telling Harlan she needed time. She thought about the particular quality of that look on his face when he'd stood in the kitchen and told her to get on the horse, not recklessness, not bravado, but the decision of a man who had determined what he was willing to stand for and was simply doing it. She thought about a room that faced east. In a morning she had woken to sunlight and the smell of coffee and the sound of horses in the corral, and the thing that had settled in her chest that she had been so careful not to name. She turned the bay's head and rode back the way she had come. Theo Alvarado, when she told him, looked at her for a long moment. "Wise or foolish," he said. "Both most likely," she said. He had considered this. Then he'd stood up and called to his men. It was dark by the time they came over the rise and saw the lights of the Maddox ranch below, and she had the specific experience of a woman who has been afraid and is still afraid, and is doing the thing anyway, which she had come to understand was not the absence of fear, but simply the decision that the fear is not the point. She rode into the yard and Cole came out the door, and she saw in his face the thing she had not let herself think too directly about, relief so complete that it stripped away everything else for a moment, all the management and the quiet and the careful distance. And he looked at her the way a man looks when something he has been trying not to want has come back. She climbed down from the bay. "I sent the wires," she said. "Aldrich is coming." "I know," he said. He sent word to Turner's office. A pause. Turner read me the wire, which was an interesting choice on his part. Is Turner going to be a problem? Less of one than this morning, Cole said. He glanced at Theo's men. Tell Theo thank you. I already thanked him. Tell him again. His voice was very even. He wrote out for you. He wrote out for you, she said. Something shifted in his face. Maybe both. They stood in the yard in the dark, and the air between them had a quality she didn't have words for. Everything that had accumulated in 6 weeks, all the evenings at the kitchen table, and the mornings at the corral, and the silences that had become their own form of conversation, pressing close in the night air. She thought she understood what it was. She thought he did too. She also thought that neither of them was quite ready to say it out loud, and that this was all right because they had time now, or more time than they'd had this morning, and some things were better assembled slowly. Nora's inside, he said. Good, she said. They went in. Inside, Nora was at the table with her book, and she looked up when the door opened, and the way her face changed, the relief in it, the particular relief of a child who has been trying very hard not to imagine bad outcomes and has been unsuccessful, was the same kind of relief she had seen on Cole's face in the yard. And she thought, this is a family learning itself. This is what it looks like at the beginning. You're back, Nora said. I'm back, she said. She sat down at the table and put the cedar box in front of her and looked at the box and then at Nora and then at Cole coming through the door behind her. And she thought about the price she had paid to get here, the 3 years of a diminished life, the weeks of fear, the months of careful calculation. And she thought it cost what it cost, and here I am. Here she was. The lamp was lit. The house smelled of dinner. The desert outside was dark and patient and enormous, and somewhere in Dusthaven, Harlan Voss was spending a very uncomfortable evening calculating his next move. And he would come again, and there would be harder days yet before this was finished. She knew all of this. She also knew that she was at a table in a house that was beginning to feel like hers, and that beside her was a child who had started to reach for her hand in the unconscious way of children who have decided someone is safe, and that behind her was a man who had not opened a locked box. These things were enough to proceed from. She put her hand on the cedar box. Tomorrow when Aldrich came, she would open it in front of witnesses and lay out the evidence, and it would begin to move through the legal process that would eventually determine what happened to Harlan Voss, and what happened to Edmund's ghost, and what happened to the particular shape her life had taken since April. That was tomorrow. Tonight the lamp was lit, and the house was warm, and she had ridden back when she could have kept going, and she was not sorry. The morning after Elara escaped to the Alvarado Ranch, Cole Maddox stood in his own yard and told Judge Harlan Voss a thing that Harlan Voss was not accustomed to being told. He told him no. He did it quietly and without particular drama in the way he did most things. Harlan had presented the papers again, with the 2 men flanking him, and the implicit pressure of a man who has authority and intends to use it. And Cole had looked at the papers and then at Harlan and said, "You're not taking anyone from this property today." Harlan had adjusted his expression to something that was patient and steely, and very slightly amused the face of a man who finds his opponent's bravado charming in the way that large animals find the bravado of small ones charming. "Mr. Maddox," he had said, "these papers represent a legal requirement." "They represent a Missouri court's opinion," Cole said. "This is New Mexico territory. My jurisdiction. Sheriff Turner told me this morning." Cole said that your jurisdiction extends to the territory under a ruling issued 3 months ago. "I'd like to see that ruling, not the letter, the original ruling, the case number, the court that issued it." A pause. "I have it in my hotel room," Harlan said, still pleasant. "Then we'll wait until you bring it," Cole said. "This is my property. I'm not obligated to enforce a document I haven't been permitted to verify." The 2 men with Harlan were watching Cole with the specific attention of men who were calculating whether they were going to need to do something. Cole was aware of this. He was also aware that he was alone in his yard with his rifle in the house, and that this was a situation that had a number of possible resolutions, not all of them good. He stood where he was. He kept his hands at his sides and his face neutral. Harlan regarded him for a long moment. "You're protecting her," he said. His voice had dropped its pleasantness. "A woman you've known 6 weeks." "I'm following legal process," Cole said. Harlan smiled, the thin, real smile, the one without warmth. "You're going to regret this, Mr. Maddox. The water rights dispute on your north pasture is a territorial matter," Cole said, "and the ruling is being appealed on the grounds of fraudulent documentation. I think you know that." Something moved in Harlan's eyes. Something that recognized and recalculated. "Bring the ruling," Cole said, "and we'll talk. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property." There was a long moment that could have gone any of several ways. Then Harlan turned his horse. "We'll speak again," he said pleasantly. "I expect we will," Cole said. He stood in the yard and watched them go, and he did not allow himself to exhale until they were out of sight because exhalation was a kind of relaxation, and he was not relaxed and would not be until he knew that Elara had made it to Theo's place and sent the wires and gotten a response. He went inside. Nora was in her room with her schoolwork, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about what he had just done and what it was going to mean. He had done it without planning, without weighing it the way he usually weighed things. He had simply done it because it was the thing that needed doing, and because the alternative, stepping back and watching a man with a Missouri judge's authority walk onto his property and take someone away against her will on papers that he had every reason to believe were fraudulent, was not something he was constitutionally capable of. He thought about when he had understood this about himself. He thought it might have been the morning in the barn when she had looked at the Hartfield letter and said, "This is good, actually," and then told him why, quickly and precisely finding the angle. The way she always found the angle, not because she was trying to comfort him, but because it was genuinely what she saw when she looked at a bad situation. He thought it might have been earlier than that. The first morning when he'd come in from the barn to find coffee made and bread started, and a woman sitting at his kitchen table who looked at him with those storm-colored eyes and did not look away. He thought about the cedar box and what she'd told him about Edmund and about the months she had spent carrying that box and those secrets in a marriage that had been a room with a lock on the outside, and about the particular quality of her courage, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. The way deep water is absolute. He thought, "I am in considerable difficulty here." He had thought he was past the particular difficulty of caring too much about someone. He had been wrong about this, apparently. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is he gone?" she asked. "For now," he said. She came in and sat at the table and looked at him with the specific evaluation she turned on difficult situations. "Are they going to come back?" she said. "Probably," he said. "Are you going to let them take Elara?" He looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old, and she was looking at him with the directness of a person who has decided that being afraid of the answer is worse than not knowing it. "No," he said. Nora absorbed this. "Good," she said, "'cause she's ours." He looked at her. She said it the way she said things that were obvious, with the mild patience of someone pointing out a fact that the other person should already have identified. He thought about this for the rest of the afternoon while he waited, and then the wire came from Theo, and he knew she had made it, and he thought about it some more in the hours before she rode back in over the rise with Theo Alvarado's men around her. And when she came through the gate, he had already understood what Nora had understood somewhat ahead of him. She was theirs. They were hers. These were the terms of it, and he was against his expectations and his history and every careful habit he'd built in the years since Eleanor left, entirely willing to accept them. They rode back through the last of the sunset. Elara and Theo Alvarado and 2 of Theo's men, and the sky above the mesa went through shades of red and orange and deep purple that had no equivalent in anything she had seen in Cincinnati or St. Louis colors, that existed only in this specific combination of altitude and open sky in the particular dust of the territory. She rode the bay and kept her hands steady on the reins and her eyes on the road, and she did not allow herself to think too directly about what she might find. The lights were on at the Maddox ranch. This was the first thing she saw as they came over the rise, the warm lights in the windows and smoke from the chimney and the ordinary domestic fact of the place still standing. She exhaled something she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the Alvarado kitchen. Then she saw that there were horses at the hitching post that were not Cole's. She rode in carefully. Cole came out of the house when he heard them, and he was not bleeding, and his face was not the face of a man who had lost anything, and she felt a rush of relief so acute it was almost physical. "Harlan," she said. "Gone," Cole said. "For now." He looked at Theo Alvarado and nodded once. "Appreciate it, Theo." "Had some wires to send," Theo said without elaborating. Elara dismounted and handed the bay to one of Theo's men. She walked toward the house. Cole fell into step beside her. Inside the warm kitchen, she saw Nora at the table with a book looking up at her with the particular relief of a child who has been told not to worry and has spent the entire time worrying. "You're back," Nora said. "I'm back," Elara said. She sat down and put the cedar box on the table because she was done carrying it as though it were something shameful. She looked at Cole. "Aldrich is coming," and she said, "3 days." Something eased in his face. "There's something else," he said. He glanced at Nora, then back at her. "Something that happened while you were gone." She waited. He sat down at the table across from her and folded his hands. Clara came back, he said, while Harlan's men were here. She brought Nora home from school. He paused. She also told me something. About herself. The quality of his voice made her go still. Clara Whitfield, he said, is Eleanor's sister. The kitchen clock ticked. The lamp flame was steady. Elara looked at him. Eleanor who left, she said carefully. Yes. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Clara came here 8 months ago because she found out where Eleanor had gone, where Nora was. She told Eleanor she would look after things. He stopped. She wasn't here for me. She was here for Nora, because Eleanor couldn't come back, or wouldn't, and Clara felt she felt responsible. She spent 8 months trying to decide if she should tell me who she was and why she was here. Elara absorbed this. She thought about Clara Whitfield's 8 months of careful presence, the meals, the curtains, the dried flowers on the table that she had assumed were territorial markers. She thought about the complexity of a woman maintaining a fiction for the right reasons, protecting a child, honoring a sister's absence, filling a gap that no one had volunteered for. She thought about herself in her cedar box. Did she tell you today? Elara asked. Today, he said. She said that when Harlan's men came, she was afraid for Nora, and it seemed like the moment to stop keeping secrets. He looked at the table. She also said she was going to go back to her people in Kansas, that she thought I had things in hand. A pause with a quality she recognized. She meant you. Nora had gone back to her book with the elaborate focus of a child pretending not to listen. Did you know? Elara asked, gently, not accusing. No. He looked up at her. I had no idea. Eleanor never told me she had a sister. He exhaled slowly, which tells you something about our marriage that I'd already worked out. Elara looked at the cedar box on the table. She thought about all the things people carried in secret, Clara's identity, Cole's shame about Eleanor, Nora's knowledge, her own box, and the $300, and the reasons she'd come west. She thought about how many of the last 6 weeks had been conducted in the shadow of hidden things, and how one by one the hidden things had come out, and the walls had not closed in. How do you feel? She asked him. He considered this. Tired, he said, and I don't know, lighter maybe than I expected. That's what happens when you put things down, she said. He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table. Elara, he said. Yes, I want to ask you something. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully in the way she'd come to recognize the deliberate assembly of a man who doesn't speak easily but means everything he says. I know why you came. I know it was partly necessity, and I know that the situation here was not what either of us expected. He met her eyes. I want to know if you want to stay. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was steady, and Nora was very carefully not looking up from her book. Not because there's nowhere else, he said. Not because it's practical, but because you want to. She looked at him. She thought about the east-facing room and the morning light. She thought about the horses in the corral and the mesa in the October light, and Nora's serious face the first day, and the way the sky went on in every direction. She thought about a man who had not opened a locked box. She thought about what want felt like. She had spent 3 years in a marriage that had carefully extinguished it, so carefully she'd almost stopped knowing the word applied to her. Yes, she said. Cole held her gaze. All right, he said. Not relief, something steadier than relief. Acceptance of a thing that had been possible for a while and was now real. But I want to be honest with you about something, she said. The federal case, even if Aldrich moves fast, even if everything goes as it should, it will take time. Harlan will fight it. He has resources and he has connections, and he will not go quietly. She looked at the cedar box. Things may get harder before they get simpler. I've never known things to go simple, Cole said. No, she said. Neither have I. The 3 days were not quiet days. Harlan Voss made 2 more appearances in Dusthaven, once at the sheriff's office, once at the general store, where he spoke loudly about the welfare of his late brother's widow in the hearing of anyone who cared to listen. The investigator was still in town. Cole received a message from Turner warning him to cooperate with the judge's request, which he read and set aside without responding. Elara spent those days organizing the documents in the cedar box into a form that Aldrich could use, a careful inventory annotated cross-referenced with the dates in the Cincinnati files. It was painstaking work, and she did it at the kitchen table in the mornings while Nora was at school, and Cole brought her coffee and did not interrupt her, and she thought this is what it would be. This is what the days would look like. work and coffee and someone who brings the coffee because they understand that this is how they can help. On the second morning, she looked up from the papers and he was in the doorway with 2 cups watching her, and he met her eyes when she looked up and did not look away or pretend he hadn't been watching. And she thought that too. That would be part of it. Aldrich arrived on a Tuesday. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 40, with a quick, attentive face and the air of a man who had been in a hurry his whole life and didn't mind it. He had federal papers. He had jurisdiction. He told her at the Alvarado house where they met, first been aware of Judge Harlan Voss's financial irregularities for 2 years and had lacked only this particular chain of documentation to move. The Cincinnati files, he said, looking at what Bauer had sent. And these, she said, and laid out what was in the cedar box. He read for 20 minutes in complete silence. Then he looked up at her. Mrs. Voss, he said, how long have you been carrying this? Since April, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite admiration, something more precise. Recognition, perhaps, the recognition of one careful person for another. It's enough, he said. It's more than enough. She pressed her hands flat on the table. It's enough, she said. Harlan Voss was served with federal papers that afternoon in the lobby of the Dusthaven Hotel by 2 federal marshals who had ridden with Aldrich from Santa Fe. The town saw it, could not help but see it given the geography of the main street and the natural human inclination to be near a window when something interesting is happening. Sheriff Turner was also served with a separate document regarding the Hartfield Cattle Company's water rights claims, which it turned out had been filed with fraudulent survey dates which Elara had already established in the documents she'd built for Cole's land dispute. This latter development was perhaps not strictly within the scope of Aldrich's federal brief. He had nonetheless included it, which Elara chose to take as a sign of either thoroughness or goodwill, or both. Harlan left Dusthaven the following morning in the company of federal marshals. He was not handcuffed in public. He was given that dignity because Aldrich was that kind of man. But he left, and his men left with him, and the investigator, who had been watching the main street for 3 weeks, was on a train headed east by noon. Elara watched the train leave from the same platform she'd arrived on 6 weeks earlier. Then she turned and walked back to the wagon where Cole was waiting and climbed up beside him, and they drove back to the ranch in the November afternoon light. They did not speak much on the road. They didn't need to. She had learned that about him, the way silence was not absence but a different mode of presence, and that in his silences she could hear, if she listened carefully, everything he wasn't yet quite able to say. Nora was home from school when they arrived. She came out of the house when she heard the wagon and stood on the porch with her serious face and her dark eyes, and when Elara climbed down, she walked directly to her and said without preamble, "Is it over?" "The worst of it," Elara said. Nora nodded. She looked at the wagon and at Cole coming around from the horses and back at Elara. "Good," she said, and went back inside. That evening after dinner, after Nora was in bed, Elara and Cole sat on the porch in the cold November air. The stars were enormous. The mesa was dark against the darker sky. The windmill turned in the distance, catching the starlight on its blades. The cedar box was inside. She'd left it on the kitchen shelf unlocked, nothing to protect anymore. It would need to be mailed to Cincinnati soon to be part of the formal record, and after that it would just be a box again, a small cedar box, the kind a woman might keep letters in. "It'll still take time," she said. "The case. Harlan will appeal anything he can appeal. This isn't finished." "I know," Cole said. "And there's the water rights. Aldrich's papers help, but the formal surveyor's process will take months." "I know that too." "I'm telling you so you're not surprised when things are difficult," she said. "Elara," he said, "I know." She looked at him. He was looking out at the dark mesa, and his profile in the starlight was the face of a man who had been alone for a long time and was not any longer and knew it. "There are things I want to tell you," he said, "about what I feel. I don't find those words easily." "I know," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "So am I," she said. He turned to look at her. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said, "of getting it wrong, of wanting something too much, of—" She stopped. "Yes, I'm afraid." "Me too," he said. They sat with that for a moment, 2 people being afraid together in the honest way, without trying to make it less than it was. Then he said, "But I'd rather be afraid of this than safe from it." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." They sat on the porch in the cold November air, and the stars were overhead, and the desert was patient and enormous around them, and the house behind them was warm with lamplight and the quiet breathing of a child asleep, and they were not touching, not yet, not quite, but they were facing the same direction, and that was its own kind of beginning. She had come here with a locked box and $342 and the practical intention of surviving. She had not expected to find a child with a rock collection and a man who had enough decency not to open a door that wasn't his. She had not expected to find morning light coming through an east window and the smell of coffee and the particular enormous sky of the territory that did not care about her past and did not ask for anything except that she be present in it. She had not expected to find herself wanting to stay not because she had to, but because she had chosen it. "Cole," she said. "Yes, I think we're going to be all right." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mesa. "I think so too," he said. Above them, the stars turned in their ancient, patient patterns, the same stars that had been there before the territory and before the ranch and before any of them. And the windmill turned in the cold wind, and somewhere in the dark, a coyote called once and was answered. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in. Inside, the cedar box sat on the kitchen shelf unlocked, holding nothing of consequence any longer. The lamp was lit. The house was warm. They had work in the morning. The weeks after Harlan's departure were not quiet weeks. Quiet was apparently not the natural state of things when you were in the process of dismantling a federal judge's carefully constructed criminal enterprise. However briefly that judge had been a federal judge before the charges had been filed and his authority suspended pending investigation. Aldrich wrote regularly. The case was proceeding. The Cincinnati documents had arrived and been certified. The Hartfield Cattle Company's fraudulent easement filing had been referred to the territorial court for review, which meant Turner's position became increasingly untenable as the weeks passed and the weight of what he'd been party to became clearer. Turner resigned his post in December. The town elected a man named Reyes, who was Theo Alvarado's nephew, and who had the kind of straight-back dignity that made Elara think the town had chosen well. She wrote to Aldrich. She wrote to Bauer. She organized the formal statements he required, and she annotated the financial records with the precision that had made Aldrich, at their first meeting, look at her for a long moment and say, "Mrs. Voss, have you considered law?" She had told him she had considered most things and had chosen life instead. He had laughed at that, and she had been startled by the sound of her own laugh in response, quick and genuine and not performed. She was laughing more. She had noticed this. Nora made her laugh regularly and without effort in the way of children who are genuinely funny without quite understanding that they are. Cole made her laugh less often and more deeply, the dry, precise observations he delivered without any alteration of expression, so that she was sometimes laughing before she'd fully understood why. She had told him this one evening, and he had said deadpan that he would try to be less funny, and she had laughed again, which she was fairly certain had been his actual intention. The water rights were resolved in January. It was not a dramatic resolution, no courtroom, no public confrontation. The territorial surveyor came out and examined the markers and the maps and the records Elara had prepared, and he issued a ruling that was 8 pages long and technical, and in its way completely decisive. The Hartfield easement had been filed with altered documentation, the survey markers had been duplicated fraudulently, and the Northwater access belonged under the original 1871 grant to the Maddox property. Cole read the ruling at the kitchen table. He set it down. He was quiet for a long moment. 8 years, he said. 8 years it was disputed. 8 years I've been farming around it, he said, adjusting, keeping the south pasture down because I wasn't sure what I had rights to. She looked at him. He was looking at the ruling with an expression she hadn't seen before, something large and old, like a door opening that had been closed for a very long time. "What will you do with the Northwater?" she asked. He looked up at her. "There's a meadow up there," he said, "along the spring. I've never been able to use it properly." He paused. "I thought maybe in the spring, if you wanted, we could ride up and look at it. What it could be." She understood what he was saying, not entirely about the meadow. "Yes," she said, "I'd like that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the ruling. 8 years, he said again quietly to himself. Clara Whitfield came by in December, the week before Christmas. She came without her apron, just herself, Clara, the woman rather than Clara, the household presence. And she sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said what she had come to say. "I'm going to Kansas," she said. "My cousin has a place in Wichita. There's more for me there than here, I think." She looked at Elara with the directness of a woman who has finished being oblique. "I hope you understand why I came here, what I was trying to do." "I think I do," Elara said. "Nora needed someone. You made yourself that person. Yes. Clara's hands were around the coffee cup. I thought for a while that there might be more to it than Nora. Cole is a good man. She said it plainly without accusation or regret. But I see what's here. I've seen it for a while. Elara did not say anything. Be good to them, Clara said. Both of them. I intend to, Elara said. Clara finished her coffee and stood up. She held out her hand and Elara shook it, and it was the handshake of two women who have been in difficult proximity and come through it without enmity. And that was more than either of them might have predicted. Goodbye, Mrs. Voss, Clara said. Goodbye, Mrs. Whitfield, Elara said. Safe travels. She stood at the window and watched Clara walk back toward town, and she thought about the 8 months of careful presence and the flowers on the windowsill and the excellent coffee, and she thought it cost her something to come here, and it cost her something to leave, and she did both with dignity. She hoped Kansas was kind to her. Nora cried a little when she heard Clara was leaving. Not a great deal. Nora was not a child who cried easily, but a little, and Elara sat on the floor of her room again, the same floor she had sat on the evening of the coyote, and Nora sat on her bed and they talked about leaving and how people carried the places they had been with them and how it was possible to love something and still move away from it and still be fine. Nora thought about this seriously. Did you love St. Louis? She asked. I loved my father's shop, Elara said, and the river in summer, and some of the people. She paused. I didn't love the life I had there, but you can love pieces of a place even when the whole isn't right for you. Do you love it here? Nora asked. Elara looked at this child with her rock collection and her serious face and her 4 months of born knowledge and her habit of asking the most direct possible question in the most quiet possible voice. Yes, she said, I love it here. Nora looked at her for a moment. I'm glad you came, she said again, as she had said before, with exactly the same weight. Spring came early that year. February brought rain and then a warm front and then a succession of days that smelled of sage and new water, and the particular green of desert plants after rain, a color she had not known existed before she came here, the fierce, short-lived green of things that have learned to live fast. On a Saturday in late February, they rode up to the North Meadow. The spring ran clear along the base of the ridge, and the meadow grass was green and new, and the sky above was that deep February blue that was already becoming warm at the edges. They dismounted and walked the meadow's perimeter, and Cole pointed out where the fence line could run, where a secondary structure might be built, how the water could be channeled to extend the usable acreage. He talked about the land, the way she had come to love, listening to him talk about it, with the specific patient affection of someone who has understood for a long time what something could be and is only now beginning to be allowed to imagine it. She walked beside him and listened. At the meadow's far edge, there was a view back toward the ranch buildings, small and solid against the red earth, the windmill turning in the light. She stopped and looked at it. It looks like home, she said. She had not meant to say it. It came out simply the way true things sometimes do. Cole stopped beside her. He looked where she was looking. Yes, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the ranch, and his profile was the same as it had been on the porch that first night, strong and weathered and showing in this unguarded moment everything it usually managed. Cole, she said. He turned and looked at her. I want you to know, she said carefully, that I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go. I had other places by February. I have other options now. She met his eyes. I'm here because I want to be here, because I choose this, the ranch, and Nora, and the water rights, and the paperwork, and all of it. She paused. And you. The meadow was very quiet around them. He looked at her for a long moment in the way he looked at things he was taking seriously, completely without reservation. I didn't know, he said slowly, that I was going to care this much. I thought practical arrangement, I thought. Something workable. He stopped. You're more than workable. She felt something warm move through her chest. That's the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, she said. He blinked. And then from somewhere unexpected, he laughed, a real laugh. Not the dry, quiet kind, but the full kind, and she laughed too. And they stood in the North Meadow in the February sun and laughed at the romance of being told one was more than workable. And it was the right thing. She thought it was exactly the right thing for them. He reached out and took her hand, just took it simply the way he did most things. She held on. They stood like that for a while, looking at the ranch below, at the country spread out around them, at the enormous patient sky overhead. She thought about the train platform in October, and the cedar box, and the $342, and all the things she had been carrying that she had set down one by one in the months since. She thought about a life she had arranged herself to fit inside that had been the wrong shape for her, and this life that was the right shape, and how strange and how necessary it had been to travel this far to find it. She was not finished. The case against Harlan would take years to fully resolve. The ranch had good years and difficult ones ahead. Nora would grow up and have her own difficulties and her own joys. There would be seasons of drought and seasons of rain and all the ordinary catastrophes of a life lived in a hard country. She was not afraid of any of it. Cole's hand was warm around hers and the sky was overhead and the meadow smelled of sage and new water, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be.